Lumber prices have gone crazy over the past few years, but the price of 2x4s has almost come down to what it was before the pandemic. There is one thing though that has not come down, and that is plywood. So what is going on here, and why are plywood prices still double what they were before the pandemic? And will prices come down anytime soon? Well, that's what we're going to talk about, so stick around. Now, I talk a lot about lumber prices, and when I do, I generally show a graph of lumber futures. The truth is that this graph really just shows one type of lumber and doesn't necessarily reflect the price of all other types of wood. One major category of lumber that's not reflected in this graph, but is used extensively in home building and other projects, is what is called structural panels, or plywood, and sometimes called sheet goods. Now, the first thing to understand here is that there are many different types of plywood. There's OSB that is used for subfloors and walls of new homes. There is particle board that's often used to build cabinets. Then you have MDF, melamine, Baltic birch, and other hardwood plywoods. All of these different types of plywoods have different qualities. They all have different uses, but there's also a lot that they have in common. The first is how they're manufactured. Any type of structural panel or sheet good is going to consist of some kind of wood material, whether it's wood chips, wood fibers, or thin slices or layers of wood called plies, which is where we get the name plywood from. These sheets also have some kind of glue or bonding agent, and once the glue is applied, the plies or other materials are pressed together to make the full panel. Plywood is a desirable material because you're able to get large sheets of wood that are really stable. Singular boards will move a lot with seasonal changes in weather and humidity, but plywoods have far less movement. Also, because of how they're constructed, plywoods can be very strong. And many types of plywoods or sheet goods use scrap from other wood products. So they're able to really get more out of less. But let's talk about prices. Now, the Federal Reserve tracks the price of plywood, and I have one of their graphs here. This graph is showing prices for domestic producers of plywood in the US for the past 10 years. Prior to the pandemic, prices were low, but at the peak of the pandemic, prices went up by over 142%. Prices have since come back down, but we can see that as of August, prices were still almost 40% higher than they were before the pandemic. My own data also supports the same thing. I keep a lumber price tracker on my website, and here's a graph of the OSB flooring panel prices over the past few years. All right, so we know that plywood prices are up, but why is it that plywood prices are still high when the price of 2x4s have come down? Well, there are two major reasons. The first is that building structural panels is an intensive process that requires a lot of inputs, far more than what you would have with just 2x4s. If you want to produce panels, there's really a lot involved. First of all, you need raw materials, whatever that may be. You also need the proper machinery to cut and press the sheets. You need glues and adhesives, and you generally need a bit more experienced manpower and expertise. And over the past few years, all of those inputs have gotten more expensive, especially that labor. Home building and lumber demand generally have also slowed down, which means that they're selling less, making each panel cost more due to the lack of economies of scale. And that's really because these plywood plants are a huge investment. It costs a ton of money to set them up, and unlike other wood mills, they're not easy to shut down. And so while you may have closures at other mills, plywood mills tend to stay open because of that expense and the capital that was used to open them up, which is why those prices stay high, because their expenses are still higher. Whereas at a regular mill, they can cut back on hours, they can change the way that they do things and save a little bit of money that way. To be honest though, why those are all reasons why plywood prices are still high, they're not the biggest reason. The biggest reason why plywood panels are still so expensive is because there are not many companies that produce them. Most of the panel market is controlled by 4 huge lumber companies: Georgia Pacific, Potluck Deltic Corporation, Weyerhaeuser, and Boise Cascade. In fact, the next time you check out sheet goods at your local lumberyard, look at the manufacturer and it'll probably be one of those 4. There are, of course, a few smaller producers, and we also buy overseas from places like China and Brazil, but generally it's going to be one of those 4. So here's the thing. It's not easy to start a plywood manufacturing company, and so there are large barriers to entry. That's not exactly the same for 2x4s. Any dude with a timber and a sawmill could saw up some boards. But panels are different, and because of that, there's not a lot of competition. There's only a few companies that do it, and so they're basically able to set whatever prices that they like. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that they're colluding to set those prices. I don't think that they're working together to make them artificially high, but there aren't a lot of alternatives, and that means that there's not a lot of competitors, and that makes the market a lot less flexible in terms of pricing, and it gives those producers a lot more power. Now, here's the thing that I think is most interesting about this whole situation. Now, if you watched my last video, you'll know that I'm predicting that lumber prices generally are going to head up, especially next spring as the building season starts. And that's really because demand from housing is going to increase, and because of the constriction of the supply of lumber at the mill due to closures and curtailments. Now, plywood mills have not been hit as hard as other mills, and they're not closing at the same rates. A lot of companies are actually investing millions more into their plywood mills to make them more efficient. And this ultimately is going to increase their capacity. So the interesting thing is that while 2x4 prices are likely to go up, plywood prices are likely to actually stay the same and perhaps even go down. Because unlike other mills, plywood mills have excess capacity and they're able to produce more. And when they do produce more, their cost per sheet is going to come down and they may be able to decrease prices. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch, but I want to know what you guys think. Have you been putting off your projects because of the high prices of plywood and other lumber? Do you think that we're going to see plywood and OSB prices jump again? Or do you agree with me that the prices for plywood and other sheet goods are going to stay steady, even if the prices of other lumber goes up? Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.